I know that.
I know that, we know that guy.
He's a past executive director and current archive manager with the Northwest Airlines History Center. Bruce is a commercial aviation history buff with a special interest in the various military activities Northwest participated in during and after World War II. In any remaining spare time, Bruce enjoys entertaining trout with his attempts at fly fishing and spending time with his 3 granddaughters. And in case you don't know it, the Northwest Airlines History Center is located at the Crown Plaza Suites, located at 3 Apple Square in Bloomington. The museum's phone number is 952-876-8777. The museum is typically open Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, 11 a.m. to 5. But I would suggest calling to make sure that they're there. And when Bruce finishes, Mike Cagley. Mike, where are you? He's going to say a few words. His father was involved in this activity also. And I will be advancing your slides.
Chief, thanks, Mike, for letting me use your mic. I'm Bruce Kitt, retired aircraft mechanic, airplane nut, certified airplane nut. I want to give you a little background how I wound up being here. And I started with Northwest in '79. When I started noticing that mechanics were wearing different uniforms and being curious, why is your uniform different than that one? I started getting different answers. Nobody seemed to agree. I started writing it down, keeping track of it, which then led to the affliction where I started wanting to ask more questions, know more, so I started looking for more. And one of the things that I was interested in that I'd never heard of either was during World War II, Northwest, among its various military contracts, had a contract to modify bombers at home and field. Dug into that, knew enough about it that coincidentally, one of the past presidents of the Air Force, 8th Air Force Historical Society, heard about me, contacted me and said, now this is in 1995, said that we're going to be doing a 50th anniversary on home front war effort. 8th Air Force, we want to talk about the Mod Center. Would you help us? And I said, oh, absolutely. You know, I think I know something about it. So I said, the only requirement I ask is that I get a copy of the sign-up sheet because they were encouraging alumni, I call them, who had worked at the Mod Center, sign up. I don't know for what reason, but I wanted a copy of it, which I got. There were probably 50 names on it, maybe 30 valid addresses. So I sent out 30 letters to the people that had signed up, expressing my interest in knowing what they had done and would they talk to me. And out of those, let's say 25, I got 5 responses. Well, 5 is better than 0. So I wound up talking with these 5 women who then kind of plugged me into their circle of friends that they had kept up with over these intervening 50 years. And that's where most of my information comes from. So now I know a little bit more. And then I rose to the notice of Don Patton and the Minnesota Historical Society World War II Roundtable. And back in 2017, I was asked to sit in on a panel that Maury Klein, the book he wrote called A Call to Arms, which is, if you get a chance, and those 2 are free, these 2 are, this one you'll lose your life, this one you'll lose your arm. But it was, I'm halfway through it still after all these years, but it is such an interesting book, how we won the war, we being the Allies. Well, so I did that. I thought people had forgotten about me, and I was very happy with that. And then Don calls me again and says, well, now we got another author. And he's got a book out, and he's going to be coming up in October, and he's going to be talking about how the aircraft industry really brought Dallas, Fort Worth area into the aviation world. North American Aviation built a huge plant down there. They built B-24s. So now, in October, you're going to see a much, hopefully, a more refined version of the story that I want to tell. But, so that's how I wound up here. So I want to share with you some of the things that have been told to me and that I've learned over the years about a very obvious remnant of World War II that probably most people, if they notice it, don't even know what it is. And that's if you drive past St. Paul Airport, home in the field, you'll see these two large curved roof buildings. And those are the last remnants of what was the Mod Center. It encompassed the entire airport at one time, and now it's just to that. So I thought I'd lead off with explaining why did they even have a Mod Center? What was the purpose? You look at the 30s and the results of the Great Depression, the Wall Street crash, it was global. So all countries were pretty much trying to dig themselves out of an economic hole. Manufacturing, in most cases, was down. Anyway, in the U.S., things were just starting to look a little bit better. But if you look around at the world, 1937, Japan escalated its incursion into Manchuria into a full-fledged war with China. In early 1938, you had Germany, France, Italy, and Great Britain get together and appease Hitler by signing the Munich Act, which they said, okay, you can take the Sudan portion of Czechoslovakia, you can have it, and that'll, as Chamberlain said, will give us peace in our time. Well, that worked for a few months, and then in '39, Hitler decided, well, I've got part of it. They didn't object, I'm just going to. And he wound up taking the rest of Czechoslovakia. So Czechoslovakia ceased to exist as a country. Then, on September 1st in '39, he turns around, he invades Poland, which then requires France and Great Britain to declare war on Germany. So now World War II is really off to a less than glorious start. In the U.S., the mood at the time was, that's Europe. We don't care about that. And Asia, well, you know, where is that? So fortunately for us, there were people who could see things a little further than most Americans could and realized that, you know, when push comes to shove, we're going to have to be ready. And the reason is that prior to World War II, everyone felt the oceans were our buffer. We didn't have to worry because, you know, it's going to take them weeks to get here from wherever they're coming from. However, Germany's success with the Luftwaffe really made people realize, well, those weeks or days we thought we had are now down to hours, and we need to be ready. And the state of the military at the time was laughable. I believe the statistic says that in the mid-30s, the entire air fleet that could be mustered, and that would be both the Army and the Navy, was 2,000 airplanes. And there was really no way to replace them on a rapid basis. Everything back then was kind of a boutique. It was built by hand. Henry Ford's idea of a modern production line was working well in the auto industry, but there was a feeling that no, that wouldn't apply to aviation manufacturing because these are more complicated, which they were. So I found this postcard, or this photo, and this pretty much to me sums up the state of America, of the U.S. during this period. This Northwest finally bought their first DC-3s in 1939, April of 1939. Well, by April of 1939, the Munich Pact had been agreed to, things were going downhill, but it's a nice shiny airplane, and Americans felt, well, things are going okay, you know, we're going to take care of ourselves, and the rest of the world can sort out its problems. Roosevelt realized, well, that's not going to work. So in 1939, he proposed legislation that basically reorganized how the executive branch of government functioned. And what he did is he tried to start creating things that would get the U.S. ready for what he and John Foster Dulles and Henry Morgan realized was going to be a war that was going to involve the U.S., but everyone's looking at Europe as the cause belli. So they start working with the manufacturers and trying to get them, you guys got to step up your production. You've got to incorporate modern production techniques because, as I think one of Roosevelt's fireside chats, he said, you know, we're going to make 10,000 airplanes. And the War Department, the Chief of Staff, you know, 10,000, we can't even make 10. How are we going to do that? But he started people and programs to start encouraging production. You know, one of the roadblocks that he ran into was that none of the companies wanted to build these planes. You know, we're going to build them, but who's going to buy the airplanes that we're going to be producing? Well, fortunately for that argument, the British and the French were interested. France hadn't fallen yet, so they were interested in beefing up their Air Force, the RAF was. They had sent 2 commissions over to talk to Lockheed and Douglas and Boeing. You know, we need planes, primarily fighters. And so there was already a little groundswell starting for, hey, you guys got to up your game. And the military at first thought, well, we'll build them then. But fortunately, again, wiser minds said, well, you're not able to. And everybody looked at the government's effort during World War I where they took over the railroads and no trains ran on time. So the realization was that, yes, that seems to be a knee-jerk reaction, but in practicality, it's not going to work. So you'll excuse me, I'm good on the general topics, the date specifics, I gotta use my crib notes here. So they came up with this idea that, well, to encourage manufacturers, what we're going to do is we're going to go on a cost-plus basis. In other words, the government's going to pay for it, or you're going to pay for it, but you're going to be reimbursed, and we're going to negotiate a profit margin for you. So I've often heard cost plus 10%. I don't know what the actual percentage was, but it was favorable enough where the manufacturers, and I'm going to limit myself to aviation, but the manufacturers said, oh, okay, so we can start doing this, and that's where Terry Ferguson will come in October. That these manufacturers did start producing or building plants with the idea that they were going to start producing on a larger scale. And concurrent with that, the Japanese seem to have decided they were going to accelerate things. So on December 7th, 1941, obviously, they attacked Pearl Harbor, and all this talk about isolationism and letting the rest of the world take care of itself became moot. And so I think, Steve, if you'll hit the next photo, now all of a sudden, these shiny new planes, I brought my own. All of a sudden, you're now sporting a slogan that says buy war bonds, because war isn't cheap, and yes, the government was going to build these facilities, but the government needed money to do so. So the military decided in January of '42 to start looking at, well, let's look at how we're going to produce these planes. Now, the idea of a production line, Henry Ford's production line is, you get that line going and it's going to be efficient as heck, stamping out the same product over and over. Well, the Air Force, or the Army Air Corps at the time said, well, yeah, but we want this. And other branches of the service said, no, we don't want that, we want this. And they realized that, well, you can't start a production line and stop it for 6 of these, start it 2 of those, and whatnot. So they realized that, well, we need a facilities or something that will take these basic planes, modify them, make them mission or theater specific. And what they did is they thought, well, let's look at the airlines. They're already set up to do maintenance on planes. They've got facilities to various capacity. So in January of '42, they started studying the possibility of this, but the war didn't wait. So in February of '42, the small little airline based in Minneapolis got a contract and 16 B-25s to start modifying for some kind of a secret project that wasn't mentioned, which subsequently became the Doolittle on Tokyo in I believe it was April of '42. So all of a sudden, these airlines, which had roughly 300 airplanes between the four major airlines, half of them were gone. They had made arrangements with the government that in a case of an emergency such as this, the government would requisition X number of airplanes on a proportional basis with each airline, which right after, on December 8th, after war was declared on Japan, they pretty much did. So now these airlines are left with facilities and people in half the airplanes. So in March of '42, Northwest was also, or Mid-Continent got the project to modify the B-25s. In February of '42, the government came into Minneapolis because they had surveyed the area already, and they took over St. Paul Municipal Airport, home and field at that time. And they kicked out Northwest Airlines, they kicked out all commercial and all non-military functions of the airport, which left basically the shell of Northwest and the 109 Guard facility, which had been nationalized, and they were gone, so their hangars were available. And Northwest wound up with some B-25s to modify for the British, which subsequently, I believe, wound up in North Africa. My understanding is they did radio conversion to radio systems that the British used. There's some debate whether, the British like the .303 caliber machine guns, the Americans like the .50 calibers. So did they swap, downgrade the caliber? That I'm not quite sure of, but that was Northwest's first mod conversions. They used the old Northwest hangar, they used the old 109 hangar, and then for expediency purposes, they just built some ramshackle structures that they threw tarps on, and some early versions of Herman Nelson heaters, and mechanics worked outside to get these projects done. And so while they were working on these temporary solutions, in September in September of '42, they started building the first of these two facility hangars that are still at home and field. So they started in September of '42. By December of '42, that one was finished, and they could start working on B-24s, which were going to become the primary airplane that Northwest modified. While that one was being finished, they started the second hangar, which is out there. And that hangar was finished by March of '43, and both of the hangars were then leased to the city of St. Paul for $1 a year, plus for the duration of the war, plus 6 months. So the military built all of these constructions. The oversight was given to the Army Corps of Engineers. Once the last nail was driven, it was transferred over to the War Department, who then subleased it to the city, who then worked with Northwest to start the Mod Center. So the first, let's see, somewhere in here, the first B-24s started arriving in mid-42, and they were the primary plane that was modified all the way to the end, to September of '45. And between that period, a little over 3,300 B-24s were modified for primarily the Army Air Corps. And a lot of the modification was, again, for a mission or a mission-specific purpose. And I think if you hit the next one.
Bruce, did those B-24s come out of Willow Run?
No, Ford wasn't up and running by 42 yet. So the two main manufacturers were Consolidated, but none of the, Consolidated was an aircraft manufacturer based in San Diego, California. They built the early prototypes for the B-24, and they built what was called the LB-30, which was kind of a transport airplane. Most of those went to the British, but they were not designed for mass production of the B-24, and they subsequently got involved with PBY and primarily Navy-focused aircraft. But North American Aviation and Consolidated built facilities, as you'll see in October. Consolidated built a huge facility in Dallas. Consolidated had one, I believe, in Tucson, Arizona. And then eventually Ford in Willow Run when they got up and running. So the planes that came into home and field, well, this will show you, at its high point, well, I shouldn't say at its high point, but at its most, there were 28 mod centers spread around the country. And as you can see, there is a publication that the Army came out with after the war that did an analysis of the modification program. This is from that publication, but it doesn't translate well to a slide. But up here in Minneapolis, Bomber Modification 12 was Northwest. T3 is a temporary, and that was mid-continent. They're the ones that did Doolittle's planes, and after that, they were done. So they were very temporary. There was also down in Alabama, Bechtel Corporation had a huge facility down there. They did slightly more B-24 modifications, but they were of a less critical nature in the sense that they didn't do some of the key modifications that Northwest did. So you had these spread pretty much around the country, and they handled every plane that was used during the war. Again, I think there were 18 primary airplanes built during World War II. Everything from trainers, liaison, fighters, light bombers, all the way up to the 17s and the 24s. And again, spread out around the country because at the beginning when the military looked at how are we going to gear up to fight this war, they realized most of the manufacturers were located right on the West Coast. Easy carrier range to the Japanese, or kind of along the eastern New England area, which they figured, well, the Germans, given their early success in 39 to 40, was a legitimate concern that they were going to soon be within Luftwaffe bombing range. So the goal was to spread it out, get your eggs out of one basket, keep the manufacturing production lines going, but get these planes to modification centers where they could be ready to literally fly from there right to the war zone that they were going to. So again, as I said, I think go ahead and hit it again, Steve. I found this on eBay, surprisingly, and I think it's a real interesting set of photographs. The photograph on the back of it says it was developed in 42, which is interesting. So it was taken in 41, and my pointer is not cooperating. This is the old Northwest maintenance facility. This is the old terminal building, which is still there, houses, among other things, Pullman's Table, which I'll put a plug in, great restaurant. This is the old 109 hangar. This was St. Paul's municipal hangars for anybody that flew in overnight or whatever. There's nothing there. There are no other structures. Mississippi, you gotta have a paddle boat. But there's nothing on the rest of the airfield. So go ahead again, Steve, please. This is my captions. During World War II, security was paramount. So I know most of the people that worked at the Mod Center, all of them had background investigations by the FBI. And I know probably the Espionage Act, they were made to sign that they're not going to divulge what they did. So you couldn't bring a camera onto any military facility, especially one that's producing planes like this. However, you go across the river to Indian Mounds Park, you have a great view of the airport. And these were taken at 2 different points, I believe in 43. And this one, the weather is better, but you don't see a whole lot of activity. But you do see, these are all B-24s here. Nothing on this. This is north, this is south. This was called the north hangar. The one inboard of it was called the south hangar. This facility was built, that was the Army Air Force Liaison Office. This photo, taken at a later date, as I said, I could count 83 B-24s sitting there, either waiting for modification or waiting to be ferried out after modification. And to me, it's just a great photo from a time when I didn't think you'd ever see another photo. And Steve, if you'd advance again, please. This is taken after the war. And it's interesting that, once again, not much going on, but the hangars are still here. There's a little bit left of the wartime construction for the Army, but the newspapers at the time called them white elephants. Who's gonna use them? They're big, they're cavernous, but Northwest is at Old Chamberlain. They don't need to come back to St. Paul. Well, it turns out Northwest did come back, and those became the maintenance base for Northwest up until they built the new hangars in '62, I believe, at Wold Chamberlain. So this is what it looked like, the Mod Center looked like in its heyday. Now this is taken from a publication for the Mod Center employees called Field and Hangar. It was, by 1945, the war was pretty much decided and the secrecy was lifted quite a bit. It's just wish I had a better pointer. So here's the north-south hangars. There was a 2-story structure that ran the 600-foot length of the hangars. The cafeteria was on the 2nd floor. There are offices and workshops. So here are the 2 hangars. As you can see, this is Army Liaison and whatnot. The 109th. These are more permanent nose hangars, which I'll show you in a moment. This was the compass rose that, after the mods were done, one of the primary navigation aids on a plane is the compass. They bring it here, it's called swinging the compass, and they make sure the compass on the plane was in line with the magnetic north, and if it wasn't, they had what's called a compass card, and that would give a deviation. And this was the gun pit. So this is where they could work, especially on the belly turret of a B-24, because on the ground it was usually retracted. There wasn't enough ground clearance to do anything while it sat on the ground. So it would taxi over, or be pulled over that, and then they could lower the gun and either calibrate it or whatever, which I'll get into in a moment. But this is what it looked like during its heyday. Now, the stream of bombers, it ebbed and flowed. Again, I'll go ahead to the next slide, I think. This is when the tide was high. This is what it looked like when a plane was, I can't stand anywhere, sorry about that. This was what it would look like if the contract to do a certain modification brought in a lot of airplanes. And I believe the hangar could accommodate 13 of them. And I haven't found anything that explains to me how the work flowed once it was there. I know they had stations all along. Each station had a certain project, so that crew of 10 or 12 would work on that project. At the end of the shift, it was moved up a station, which meant that one at the end came out. And then at the other end, another one would come in. So it was just cycled through like that. Again, this is during a peak period.
Typically, how long did the modification take? Days or?
There were 8 stations, so it was projected it would take 8 days. They worked 3 shifts when there was a lot of work. I know that some of the women I spoke with said, you know, yes, there were times when they worked 3 shifts. They had 3 shifts running, and there were other times when they were down to 2. And again, it's interesting. It wasn't a steady flow. Again, it was kind of project driven. Again, Steve. These are, if you remember back to that map I just showed you, those tarpaulin temporary nose hangers were replaced with built structures. And these had pneumatics that had heating in it. It was geared way better efficiently for doing the mod work. And, you know, permanent and temporary, as opposed to temporary, I guess. Go ahead, Steve. So what did they do? Well, here's one of the big projects. This is an F7. An F7 is a B-24 that's been modified for photo reconnaissance work. And what they did is the B-24 had 2 bomb bays as opposed to 17's one. What they did is they took both of the bomb bays out. Usually the forward bomb bay became extra fuel tanks because these were flying long, especially in the Pacific, long-range photo recon. And then a complete photo lab was constructed in the second bomb bay. Now this one is talking, the big focus, and it's difficult to see, but there's 3 cameras that were designed that would give something like a 120-degree panoramic view. One looked down, and the other 2, I think, were angled at 30 degrees. It was called a, anyway, it was a 3-camera setup, in addition to other cameras that were in it. But what's amazing to me is the B-24 came in, the bomb bay doors were there. Now these were very thin, 32 thousandths, I believe, corrugated aluminum. There wasn't much to them, but they came that way. So that means they removed those, and everything that went into the 2 bomb bays then was brought in and put in place. So this photo lab would have been a kit. And they would have brought in sidewalls and then the equipment and whatnot, which would have taken a while. So to me, it's an ingenious modification for a very specific purpose. And the claim to fame for most of, well, the 2 F7s that get all the fame were the 2 that photographed Truck Lagoon during World War II. And that kind of opened the military's eyes to, oh, well, this is kind of the Japanese version of Pearl Harbor because it was so full of ships. But it's just interesting what they did, all the different equipment that would have to go into it. Now, you don't just do something like this on the fly. You know, it's got to be designed, it also has to be approved, and then the mechanic that works on it has to know what they have to do. So what they would do is they'd come up with an engineering order, and this is an actual one, removing all of the leading edge anti-ice boots. So that tells me this is going to the Pacific, not to Europe or anywhere. But this, I was told, is pink paper. All the engineering orders were, you know, that was the Bible, that was telling you what you were going to do. They were on pink. And it would tell you, you know, you're going to, in this case, you're deleting propeller anti-ice systems. If you go to the next one, what they then did is from that, they would build a material list. And this lists all the nuts and bolts, literally, that you're going to use for the project. And so there was a group, there was a department within the Mod Center, and they would take this and they would assemble it in a kit. And then they had parts writers. We still had them when I was there in '79, that your workstation, if this is what you were going to be working on, well, parts runner would bring a kit out to you. you would not have to go wandering around looking for an AM nut or a MS fitting or anything such as that. It was all there. It told you what drawings you're going to be working with, and it gave you other references. It called out the specific hardware, described it so that you knew what you were doing. And that's what they would do.
Obviously, Northwest didn't build the cameras or the photographing. Those had to come as a module from where?
It depends. The other main project, which I have a little bit on, was a British design system, a radar system. They call it the H2S. They shared it with the US, Honeywell. They refined it, it became the H2X, and that was built in Minneapolis. So yes, the components, just like airplane construction, like Ford did, you had your main production line, which in this case would be the modification line, but you had all the materials you need coming in from usually a subcontractor. I mean, Northwest didn't make it, Honeywell did in this case, so Honeywell would deliver X number of them. And so it was a choreographed operation. I mean, you look at what it took just to roll one of those B-24s out of the hangar, ready to go to whatever theater, and you just follow the work further upstream to see where it all began and how all the parts got to where they had to be on time to create it. Go ahead, Steve. So this is, again, another eBay find, if you know what you're looking for. So here is a project engineer, it says, and it's a trimetragon camera. So he's looking at another one, because I believe in the earlier schematic, this is one, there's one here, and there's one on the other side. But that, I call it a photo lab, because that would take the picture. They had the darkroom ability. They could process the film on their way back. So when they landed, they just handed the intelligence officer, yeah, here's what we saw. And he's got it. He's got a photo of it. And they can plan their missions immediately from that. There wasn't, you didn't have to mail it in and wait for the mail to come back with your highly sensitive photos. So it's interesting because it shows that, to me, it's been insulated in some way. It looks like it's got a door, which I would want because, airplanes don't always return to base and I'd want to get out of there if I had to. But the degree of planning for this one specific purpose is just fascinating. So, again, Steve. So who did the work? Go ahead. So the photo on the left is an airline employee. This is a person that worked for Northwest Airlines. The badge on the right is a person that worked at the Mod Center. And the shapes are different, the career paths are different, because when the war began, these people worked for the airline at the beginning of the war. They had a job after the war. The people that wore this shield type badge, when the war ended, their employment ended. Now, the striping does mean something, but again, we found nothing yet in writing to prove it. But one color would be the Mod Center. One color would be ice research. Northwest had other projects going on up at Wood Chamberlain Field at the time, one of which was ice research. And one of the colors would be the northern region, which is the Air Transport Command contracts Northwest had with the military to fly supplies up to Alaska. And it's just interesting. You'll see these around once in a real blue moon, and so you know what they are. It's interesting. This was security. They put the photo in. This is a soft lead slug, and they had a little crimping machine that would just flatten it out, put NWA on it, tamper-proof. I started in '79, left in 2005. We had that same piece of equipment with the same die, and that was used on the life vests under the seat. And if you've ever sat through the safety briefing, you're told if it's an overwater flight, your life vest is under your seat, you just pull it out. Well, when you pull it out, you break a very weak, thin copper wire. And that was just to make sure nobody had taken it during flight. It was one of our pre-checks, just to make sure that there was a life vest there. But that's what we would use. If we replace the life vest, you put it in there, you run the copper wire, you take that seal and you just squeeze it. And it was just, you know, something from World War II that was still being used in 2005. Just amazing. Go ahead. Who did the work? Again, as part of the buildup that the government realized it had to do, there was a phrase that Roosevelt came up with, alphabet soup. There was a three-letter initial for everything. There's NRA, National Recovery Act. There was RFC, Reconstruction Finance Corporation. There was also an organization called the National Youth Association. The National Youth Association was designed to get graduating high school students into a vocational trade that could be applicable if we ever had to go to war. Thought ahead. So what they would do is they would go to high schools and they would talk to the graduating senior student, because some of the schools were pretty small, or class, and they would advocate, look, if you're not going to college and you're not going back to work on the family farm, how about a trade skill? And they would encourage students, graduates, to sign up for this. Now, of these women that I spoke with, every one, except one, every one of them did this. They were approached on their graduation by an NWA representative. Are you interested? Yeah, they were. So they went, and this was all on the government's dime. They went from wherever they were. A lot of them were from farming towns in Minnesota and the Dakotas. One of them wound up in Duluth. They had housing available to them. They were there for, I believe, 6 months, learning basic drill skills, lathe operations, sand belts, you know, which end of a screwdriver is the hammer and which end is the screwdriver. Very effective program. When they graduated or finished that class, then there was somebody from an industry who would talk to them. Hey, now that you know how to, would you like to come work for our company? So again, this one particular woman, they came up to the, and there were a lot more. Now this is, I'll come to this photo in a moment. And they'd say, okay, I represent, and in her specific case, Maytag in St. Paul, the railroads, and Northwest. Would you come work for us down in the cities? Yeah, sure. So they all come down to the cities, and they're split off. And one of them went back and asked their teacher, gosh, you know, who should I go with? I mean, you know, the airline sounds like fun, but all my friends are going out, they're welders, they're going out to the West Coast to work in the shipyards. And the sage advice was, who pays the most? So she stayed in St. Paul and went to work for the airlines. So they come to the airlines. In Minneapolis, in the Twin Cities area, there were 3 aviation training schools. There was, I can't remember the names. There was one in Minneapolis near the Basilica.
Dunwoody.
No, it was not Dunwoody. No, these were focused on aviation. So they're teaching students how to drill rivets, which is a lot more critical than, you know, beating it out with a hammer, I suppose. But they were focused on sheet metal, welding, and drilling and riveting. And so there was one in Minneapolis, there were 2 in St. Paul. One of them was at 7 Corners or in that vicinity. The other one, I don't know where a St. Paul Vocational Training Center was back in 1941. But they then went to a facility such as this, where you can see these women are working on sheet metal in this particular case, well, sheet metal department. They would go into electrical, because there was no electronics, so they would go into soldering, crimping, things such as that. Welding, they would start welding aluminum and getting used to welding softer materials or material for aircraft. So this should, before you go back one, would you? Back one more. What I find interesting, this was World War II. I agree with these two authors. This was a production war. Germany had great equipment, but they had limited resources. We had unlimited resources and an unlimited pool to draw from. And whoever built the most widgets was going to win the war. And the example that's always given is, the German Tiger tanks, marvelous pieces of equipment, just like a Swiss watch. Problem is, very finicky, like a Swiss watch. The Sherman, a metal coffin, but boy, you get 5 of them against one Tiger, and the outcome is usually predictable. What I find interesting about this is, first off, they're all women. The only men that you're going to see there are instructors. The other really interesting aspect of this is there are, I believe, there are 2 black women. If you don't think this was a total war effort, look at this, then look at the shipyards. I mean, look at all the industries. But it's just, this is how participatory World War II was on the home front. So go ahead. This is another one. This is a mock-up of a B-24. This is actually, you'd be looking from the waist gun forward. This is actually, the bomb bay would be down here. But they're learning how to drill and rivet on a real piece of airplane. And again, there were a number of these. It's interesting when you talk about how many airplanes were produced, how many mock-ups were produced for training purposes. And that's something that's, that's not a real airplane, that's part of, so I don't know if it was ever accounted for, but they were in all industries. So you get these people, now these are from my collection. These are job functions. Most of them are pretty self-explanatory. My understanding from what I've been told is a B-24 would come in, it would land. It was always ferried by Air Transport Command pilots. So the 5th and the 7th were primarily the commands that flew from Texas and Arizona up here or from Michigan. So they'd come in, they'd hop out, they'd go into the Army Air Force liaison shaft, turn in the logbooks for the plane, and the story I've been told is the Army Air Corps would sell the airplane to Northwest for $1. Now it's Northwest's asset. They do the modification. When they were finished, after it was inspected, Northwest would sell it back to the government for $1. And then it became the property of the War Department. But what you have here are, you have inspectors. These, especially this, they're all critical, because if the work isn't done right, it's not going to function properly, and the mission, the purpose is pointless. Special crew, I believe, when a plane came in, they would remove what was called GFE, government furnished equipment. And this is sensitive equipment, so everyone defaults to the Norden bomb site. Well, what's interesting is by early '43, the secrecy of a Norden bomb site had been downgraded from confidential to secret. And there's a story that said, well, you know, what happens if somebody steals one and they give it to the Germans or the Japanese? And the response was, good. It's going to take them 6 years to take it apart, figure out how it works, put it back together, and then start manufacturing. By that point, they weren't worried. Enough had been shot down and recovered. The Germans knew enough about it. They never came up with an equivalency. But this crew would take something like that, which is what everyone thinks of. First aid kits. All of the first aid kits had morphine. Those were taken. Not all the guns were removed, because if the modification didn't deal with guns, why take them out? Because there's no ammo with them anyway. So they would remove critical items like that. They were stored in a warehouse. Documentation said it came from plane such and such. When the plane was finished, they'd go back to the warehouse, build out plane such and such equipment, and back into the plane it went, and off it went. Interestingly, Northwest had its own fire department and security department. At its high point, there were 400 firemen. Now, I've got to believe that spread over 3 shifts over 4 years, but that's a large department. The police department was the same thing, and these were, a lot of them, retired police or firemen from the Twin Cities area or from other cities that came here because it was a job opportunity. Groomers, they cleaned up the plane after all the mod center work had been done. You know, they'd vacuum up, make sure there were no chips, tools, anything lying around that could interfere with the operation of the plane. So this is the high level. This is an inspector's badge. I think this came before the buttons. It's just felt with a felt eye, and they wore it. I've seen photos where they have inspector armbands. Those were in red. Love to find some of that. So go again. So those were in charge. These, I have no idea what the numbers represent. You know, it's a military project. I don't know if it was Mod Center. I don't know if it came from Lord Chamberlain because they had an Air Transport Command contract, so was it related to that? I've never seen any Mod Center photos where people are wearing these, but I don't know what it is. And then these are the workers. So all the people that came to work for the Mod Center, self-explanatory, they all wore these, and you'll see them in a lot of photographs. You know, electrical, oxygen, sheet metal. I haven't seen if there's any other branches or any other skill sets that wore the badges, but these are what the actual workers did. So if you go again, Steve. And then there's a union, and you'll see union buttons on it. And the union on the property, actually the dominant union at that time, up until the end of World War II, was the Airline Mechanics Association. Not everybody joined it. The ones that are wearing this badge are probably airline employees who are working at the Mod Center in some capacity. So there pretty much you have it. I don't think I have anything after this. There it is today. I took that Saturday. That's what's left of the Mod Center, the 2 hangars. The 2-story structure between it is gone. It had been 3M's hangar for a number of decades, which means the door was never open, frankly. I don't know how they got airplanes in and out. I had an opportunity to go in once. You can take a picture of anything except an airplane. And I was there to look at the building, so I have a lot of interior architectural photos, but nothing of their airplanes. But it's still in use today. So it was built during the war, it was used during the war, it was, from the military's point of view, abandoned. Northwest went back and used it. When they moved up to MSP, it still found another use, and I hope somebody moves in after that. But September of '45, when people showed up to work, none of them got in the gate. They were told, the war is over, your work is over, hand in your badge and any company tools, and thank you for your service and go home. And it's interesting from the women's point of view. You know, war is hell. You know, there's no getting away from it. But the women that work there, to a woman, they said two things. They earned more than their dad. And it was the first time they were economically independent. And you know, they went home with money in their pocket. They could help support the family during rationing and all that. But that they earned more than their dad. Now, you know, there's, you know, that's not a universal truism, but that's the way they felt. And they all said it was the best time of their lives. They said, you know, we had money in our pocket. We could go out. They loved bowling. That seems to have been the major recreational activity. They said, you know, we could go out and do things. You know, it really opened up their lives. And to a woman, they were all disappointed. They had to go back and wash dishes at home. You know, in many ways, in many aspects, for many people. The other thing to bear in mind, when I talk about how the women were working here, it applied to all the participants in World War II, Axis and Allied. I mean, even the Germans, even the Japanese, you know, they had the civilian population doing things to contribute to their respective war efforts. Just fortunately, they didn't have as much as we did. But it's just amazing. For something that was so major for 42, 3, 4, and part of 45, and then it just evaporated. If any of you have ever been to the San Francisco Bay Area, Sausalito, huge Kaiser Liberty shipbuilding facility stretched for several miles along Sausalito Bay. There isn't a thing left of that either, which is kind of a good thing. You know, it was built for a purpose. Once the purpose was over, you know, plowshares or swords back into plowshares. So that concludes my presentation. I would ask you if you know of any family or neighbor members who may have worked at the Mod Center. I'd love to talk with them. The memories, like all of our military during World War II, they're going every day. And this is such an unacknowledged, unrecognized effort that I hate to see go away. So again, if you know of anyone, please ask them to contact me, because I would love to talk to them about it and get their memories somehow recorded for posterity. So upon that note, thank you very much.
Michael, would you come up for just a moment, add to this?
Welding out when I started at RG Anderson, my mother had.
Good afternoon. My name is Mike Hagley. I had absolutely no idea what I was saying in the days, so bear with me. I have no slides. Although I do have some things that might be interesting to see. I've got a couple hard copies. I have a personal connection, family connection with the Mod Center. I can date the day I met Bruce Kitt. It was at Wings of the North Air Expo in 2006, Northwest. History Center had a booth. My father, his brother, my uncle, their sister, my aunt, the Northwest employees, as was my mother. I owe my existence to Northwest Airlines. My mother, Bruce showed the DC-3s in 1939. My mother was hired as a Northwest stewardess in 39. My mother was hired in 1939. She was, according to the records we have, one of the first 6 stewardesses that were hired. I know she wasn't number 1, and she always told me she was number 3. But there were no seniority records kept because it was a temporary job. other things. You had to be single, you got married, you automatically resigned. So there was no career like seniority list. My father and uncle were pilots for Northwest, both started just at the late early 40s. And the war comes along, they volunteered. First I thought they were Shanghai, but my uncle's wife corrected me. She said, no, they volunteered because the military pay was better than the Northwest pay. And they were assigned to the northern region that Bruce mentioned, which is primarily the very western side of Alaska, Canada, and all through Alaska. At the age of 5, I knew Kiska, Attu, Unalaska, forgotten all the names, so I have them on a map at home. Normally 5-year-olds don't know the names of the Aleutian Islands. I've got them all at home on a big National Geographic map. I've got my dad's logbooks for World War II. Okay, how does that come to the Mod Center? Well, they had X number of hours for government flying, which was the Air Transport Command. And if they came back at the end of the month, and we do that kind of a monthly duty cycle, they came back, if they still had hours that they could claim and fly for the government, they went to home and field, took B-24s out of the hangar, and took them out on test flights. The other part of the connection was, as I said, my aunt, a sister of my father and uncle, was a registered nurse. They apparently, all of them from central Illinois. If I said Peoria, that'd get you close. Never know the name of the town. And they must have told their sister, hey, it's kind of a good gig up here. Why don't you come up here? You've got a nursing degree. That's always going to find you something. She was the nurse at the Mod Center. And I've got pictures of that at home in some Northwest publications. She also saved and gave me copies of her paycheck stubs. If I'd known I was going to say anything today, I would have brought them. You couldn't buy half a bag of groceries for the monthly pay. But it was good money at the time. And so the men would come back, fly the B-24s out on a check ride, make sure that controls were wired properly. One thing that Bruce didn't say that occurred was, the first question I asked, why was there a mod center? What was wrong with the planes that they had to be modified? Well, as he alluded to, they were specialized. But what that implied was every plane that came out of the production facility was plain vanilla for the maximum amount. And Ford was putting them out 1 an hour. And so they didn't allow all of the fine touches and fine tuning. They went, as Bruce showed, there were several mod centers across the country. They knew they could modify them later. If they couldn't use the plain vanilla one, they sent them there and they took off the de-icing boots and added radar. For example, you can add radar equipment to the planes in the mod center a lot more securely than you could on the Ford production line. So if you're trying to keep something kind of secret, the mod center was a place to do it. Back Bruce, meeting him at Air Expo 2006. I met Bruce. I walked about 3 feet. The 8th Air Force had a booth at the air show. There's a fellow sitting right here, not talking to anybody. So it says 8th Air Force, so I assumed he had something to do with it. Very interesting individual. Anyone know or remember Larry Bachman? It was Larry Bachman. And we got talking, and he said, well, he flew B-24s, and yeah, he kind of flew a lot, but he was sort of the co-pilot. His captain was kind of short, planes and Wimpy's Queen on one side. First time I've ever seen, and the only time I can remember, because he showed me the model, the plane that said Wimpy's Queen on one side, which is kind of a reference to the pilot, first, who was rather short. And on Larry's side of the plane, it said YMCA Delivery Service. Maybe someone could give me the background on the names of those two. But anyway, got talking to Larry, and I said, gee, my father flew modified B-24s out of the Launch Center in St. Paul. I've always wondered what happened to them. Well, if you have the tail numbers, I might be able to find out. I got my dad's logbooks. So I went home, and I started recapping all of the planes that my dad flew. Most of them in the ATC, Air Transport Command, were C-46 and C-47s. He did not like the C-46. They had a big, underpowered, loved C-47, better known as the DC-3, which is what he was used to flying as a Northwest pilot. So, at this column over here, B-24s, I believe I counted correctly, there were 16 of them. So, I sent the list to Larry with a little cover letter, and Larry, a couple months later, handwritten at the bottom of the page, sent me back this list and said, basically, I've done the best I can. I sent the list to a friend of mine in the 8th Air Force. Unfortunately, he passed away before he finished the list, so it's a partial listing, but I'm sure you'll be interested. This is what he sent me. And you'll be happy with, I think, as I said, I think there were 16. About half of the planes, there were 8, they went to the 5th Air Force. I'm sorry, the 8th Air Force. Some went to the 5th. And if you really want to get into it, if you're an 8th Air Force nerd, I've got bomb group and squadron numbers on here that if he was able to find it. Sometimes the records weren't, as complete as you might like. They weren't really big. Why would you want to keep track of B-24s or B-17s or anything like that? The war's over, throw the paper away. Just one thing, and I called her as soon as I received this to, first of all, thank you profusely for doing this. And I said, Larry, I think there's a typo on your sheet. He said, I know exactly what you're going to say. He said, I have the same question. He asked his friend who did most of the work on this, if that number was correct. And it was a 8th Air Force plane, which I believe was the Pacific. We'll go through. Pardon?
8 was your name.
No, I'm sorry, not the
5th, would be the 5th.
The 5th. The 5th. 8 is England, yes, I know that for a variety of reasons. Not the least of which the ones in the North Museum. That's a 8th Air Force memorial book that I see every week. But this was the 5th. First thing that caught my eye was, I thought it had kind of a clever name for the plane. Many of the planes have been named, not necessarily all of them, nor did, if it was named, did the government necessarily even record the number of the name. Meant the spelling, people know about that. But this one had the clever name of Gone with the Wind. Oh, cute. The main thing I was, Larry filled in all of these blanks. I mean, I had no clue or real interest in what Air Force, what bomb group, what squadron, etc. Most of them were filled in. But then my other question was, whatever became of these planes? So, some of them were shot down, some of them crashed in training, a number of them were salvaged, and here's the one on Gone with the Wind. Salvaged in U.S. after 143 missions. That's stunning. That must have been, I think there was a phrase called really Willie. That that plane had to be on this last legs. But I assume there may have also been some level of superstition for the people who flew these planes. And I think that plane is probably regarded as a very lucky airplane. So I did talk to Larry on a few other things. No real disagreements with anything that Bruce said. I just felt so lucky to have met him and asked the question, and he dug into it and got back to me with this answer. So and I have to thank Dan, who went through the wings of the North Museum, that's where I met him. And we got talking, and he told me about this before I knew about this, because when Bob Jasperson, he and Judy are kind of my bosses at Wings of the North, and he put me on your mailing list. Saw this one, and I said, I've got to go to that. And so I didn't mean to take any more of your time. I wanted to show this to Bruce because he's the expert on that place, but I just wanted to let you know about a personal family involvement with my father and uncle and aunt, heavily involved with that place. Thank you.
Questions of either one?
Can I have the mic? Yeah.
A couple of things, if I could chime in with what you said. Again, sometime I can't remember what I did yesterday, but I recall one of the things I saw with Larry Bachman was some aerial photographs of the Mod Center. Did either of you ever see that?
Yeah, there's a Mike Hurd photograph of a 3 over the Mod Center, but it's a distant shot. It focuses the airplane, not the Mod Center. But no, now that I think there's a second one, it is a direct view down of the Mod Center. It's showing quite a number of 24s around the rim.
Well, as I recall my failing memory, Larry actually had pictures before the buildings were built and the planes were actually sitting out. Have you seen that picture before? I could be wrong, but another book that I tried to bring today, I mentioned it to Bruce. There's a book by a guy named A.J. Bain, B-A-I-N-E. He wrote a book called The Arsenal of Democracy. It is about the well-run operation, and I wish I would have found that today. One of the things that I have asked Terry Ferguson when he comes up in October to speak, his book is about the Dallas story, but as many of you know, my son retired from the Air Force, and 2 weeks ago, he got a tour of the Lockheed Martin facility in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. It is a B-24. I think it is this very favorite picture that's in his book on page 189. It's a mile-long assembly line that is still there. And again, my son, his liaison is with Lockheed Martin. But they built B-24s there. Again, it's a mile long. Until several years ago, it was the assembly line for F-16s. They moved the F-16s to Greensboro, North Carolina, I think it is. It is now the assembly line for the F-35. So I invite you to come to our program on that. Is Jim John still here? The story of the programs of the workers is very similar to the story that Jim Johns talks about with the glider program. And as you know, Minnesota was the second largest manufacturer of gliders, again, as a part of a Northwest Aeronautics subsidiary. And one of our mutual friends, who was at Dunwoody, he actually provided me with information that they actually had an aviation training center. He actually had documentation and pictures of a Dunwoody aviation, and I think, I can't remember the period for that. It could have been before or after, but I'm not questioning your, one of the other things, I had a sister of my father who was in the Air Transport Command. He was killed in India. His B-25 exploded on takeoff. Nothing was left. But he has provided, or she has provided me stuff from him of postcards of St. Paul.
Take care.
When he brought
Safe.
things to the mod, I'm requesting the mod center. But part of my question is, how did the guys that brought the planes into the mod center, what happened to them? Did they take planes that were finished to another location?
I learned an interesting little side note to that. Yeah, they were ferried in by the Air Transport Command. It was usually a three-man crew, pilot, co-pilot, and a flight engineer, 2 officers, and then an enlisted man. They all seem to be corporal. They fly in, turn the plane over to Northwest. The facility at Northwest, I understand, had a bunkhouse, and they would be there. Initially, they were assigned to the plane. So the plane came in, if it was there for 8 weeks, or if a problem developed and it was there longer, those 3 would be there. And they liked that, because they were, a week on their own, in town, in uniform. Gosh, you can only imagine.
For them.
Yeah, on the government's time. They changed that policy to where they came in, dropped off the plane, and there was always a line of planes ready to go back. So they would just be told, take this one and fly it to wherever. And it's interesting, in late 1944, they were producing more B-24s than they could use. And they were just parked all over the country. And when the mod center shut down, there were still 100 and some odd planes left here. They said they still went through the mod, whatever they were going to be modified for, and then they flew them to Kingman, Arizona, and they parked them there in Stratton. They never left the country. But to your question, yeah, they learned. Crews that would fly in, they would fly them out, and if there were no planes, they'd send us Air Transport Command C-47, pick them up, take them back to their headquarters, and they'd ferry other new planes to another, or the same facility.
Thank you all for coming. Our next meeting will be on August 14th. Our speaker will be Dr. Zek, who is right here. We'll wait for him to talk next week, or 2 weeks. Thank you. Stay safe.